Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us in another episode in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, episode number 19. And we have with us today Dr. Professor Ron Stockton, also Ambassador Dr. Ali Ajami, the President of the Arab American Center for Culture and Arts, and Dr. Muhammad Ajalani as a guest from Paris. Welcome all.
Good morning.
Hello.
As we enter the seventh month of the war on Gaza and the continued genocide against the Palestinians, with about 35,000 people killed, including more than 14,500 children, and more than 78,000 people injured, and more than 8,000 people missing. A genocide recorded and shared on social media day by day. Gaza is 80% destroyed, and more than 1.5 million people are refugees from one part of the city to the other, changing depending on the whim of the Israeli warplanes and tanks. The genocide is taking place by Israel with the pretext of October 7th attack by the Islamic resistance movement in Gaza called Hamas. Hamas-led surprise attack across the apartheid border, killing more than 1,200 Israelis and seizing 253 hostages on October 7th, 2023. Even as the Rafah gate is choked by the Israeli tanks and the noose is tightened around Gaza, a sickening new report from CNN came out last month exposing a secret desert prison where Israeli occupation forces are torturing Palestinian detainees. Horror upon horror. 3 Israeli whistleblowers have come forward with the details and photographic evidence of psychological and physical torture, including ritualistic humiliation and dehumanization of Palestinian citizens unlawfully incarcerated in Israel's Negev desert. Whistleblowers describe prisoners' limbs being amputated due to injuries caused by constant handcuffing and medical procedures performed by underqualified medics, branding the prisons with the nickname "a paradise for interns." The images shared by the whistleblowers are too disturbing to share here. It's a shocking throwback to innocent Iraqis detained in Abu Ghraib prison and tortured at the hands of US forces and contractors, torture that was exposed to the world exactly 20 years from today. We don't know the total of number of Palestinians who have been herded into detention camps like Sdi Timan. We do know the number is in the thousands, if not tens of thousands, and that they were taken from both Gaza and the West Bank. We don't know how many more of these secret prisons exist, and we can be certain we have not heard the worst of the abuses yet. All this is taking place in partnership, enablement, financing, diplomatic cover, total support, weapons supply, technology supply, intelligence cooperation of the American government. It bears repeating that President Biden could end all of this right now with a single phone call. Instead, our government continues to funnel weapons and cash to Israel indiscriminately. Our government's continued unconditional diplomatic cover for these horrors makes our country complicit in Israel's war crimes. America is committing a genocide today, and America will be judged harshly by history as Britain was, and France was, and the Ottoman Empire was. Consequences will come one day. Reparations and justice will be requested one day. How did America get all the way here? While it was a beacon of freedom and justice in the world. America that represented liberty's awakening revolted in 1775 with emerged ideals that forged the foundation of a new era. Liberty, the beacon illuminating the path to emancipation, beckoned those yearning for autonomy and self-determination. Equality, a cornerstone of justice, echoed the call for fairness and opportunity for all. Self-government, the embodiment of democratic principles, empowered citizens to shape their collective destiny. Representation, the linchpin of legitimacy, ensured voices were heard and interests were safeguarded. Natural rights, inherent and inviolable, affirmed the sanctity of individual dignity and autonomy. Patriotism, the unifying force, inspired allegiance to a shared vision of a better tomorrow. And the rule of law, the bedrock of order and justice, upheld the promise of a society governed by principle rather than caprice. Many fought and still do for these ideals to stand as enduring testament to the enduring power of a human aspiration and the relentless pursuit of freedom, equality, and justice for all. There were setbacks, but Americans recover from these setbacks, whether it is fighting to end slavery, marching to end racial segregation, protesting for women's rights, occupying Wall Street to fight corruption, university students protesting Vietnam War crimes, and again for divestment from genocide today. Americans continue to fight to protect their ideals, whether from the corrupt politicians who have been put in their places by the lobbyists or from the aristocracy represented today by the corporate money in politics or by the extreme religious groups that try to sever the wall between church and state. Among such trials to get back to the ideals of America comes President Wilson, who presented 14 points in 1918. Woodrow Wilson became President of the United States in 1912, advocated for the United States to adopt an international policy based on moral diplomacy. Moral diplomacy called for the United States to promote more democratic ideals abroad. When World War I erupted in 1914, Wilson advocated for the United States to remain neutral in the conflict, and in 1916 ran and was re-elected on the platform, "He kept us out of war." But when the United States was drawn into war, Wilson hoped to end World War I and that peace without victory could be achieved. He believed that for the war to move forward, neither the Allies nor the Central Powers could claim victory at the end of the war. In January 1918, he developed what he believed to be the framework for lasting world peace. This framework is known as the 14 points. The 14 points outlined by Wilson in a speech to the United States Congress on January 8, 1918, served as a blueprint for post-World War I peace negotiations and reflected his vision for a new world order. These 14 points were intended to address the underlying causes of World War I and to establish a framework for a lasting peace based on principles of justice, democracy, and cooperation. While some of Wilson's ideas were incorporated into the Treaty of Versailles and other post-war treaties, the full realization of his vision was hindered by various political, diplomatic, and economic factors. Nonetheless, the 14 points remain a significant landmark in history of diplomacy and continue to influence discussions on international relations and peace-building efforts. It is President Wilson's American ideals that Arabs aspired for during Versailles negotiations, and King Faisal addressed the president directly. It resulted in something the French and British fought so hard, which became the King Crane Commission. The King Crane Commission, which was supposed to be an inter-allied commission, but was hindered by Britain and France, so America decided to do it alone, was a diplomatic mission dispatched by US President Wilson in 1919 to investigate the opinions of people in the Middle East regarding the future political status of the region. They were led by Henry Churchill King and Charles R. Crane. The commission traveled extensively throughout the Levant, meeting with local leaders and communities. Despite its findings indicating widespread support for Arab independence and opposition to the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, the recommendations of the commission were largely disregarded by the subsequent Treaty of Versailles negotiations. This disregard contributed to the long-standing tensions and conflicts in the Middle East, particularly regarding the issue of Palestine. This report remained in the desk of Wilson, who had a brain stroke at that time, and his presidency ended soon after, and it was never published for years to come afterwards. Now, it was published later, but had no significance after already all the treaties were signed. To talk more about this and to zoom in on this, a subject that have aspiration and inspiration in it, has disappointment in it, and has the question, can America come back to diplomacy that focuses on democracy and the consent of the governed, as the Declaration of Independence states? With me, Professor Ron Stockton, professor of political science in the University of Michigan, to talk more about this. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. That was a very impressive introduction. It left me with a lot to think about. I just got back from Palestine from 8 days. I talked to a lot of people, and I would say that whatever we've heard, I think you've hinted at this, whatever we've heard about human rights abuses, it's probably worse. There's things going on that we don't know about. Perhaps someday we'll find out. I don't know. Before we turn to the 14 points, I want to say a few things about Wilson. As a young professor, I loved Woodrow Wilson. He was a political science professor, which is what I am. He wrote several very impressive books. The most impressive was how Congress and the presidency interacted. Probably when he was negotiating over the League of Nations with the Senate, he should have gone back and reread his book. But nevertheless, he was a very impressive scholar. He became president of Princeton, instituted a new curriculum which became more relevant to the lives of people. Ironically, he won the presidency in a three-way race. Teddy Roosevelt, who was not the nominee, decided to run on the Bull Moose Party, a third party, and he split the Republican vote. The Republicans were the dominant party at the time, and he split the Republican vote and managed to allow Wilson to be elected on, I think, 42% of the popular vote, but more of the electoral college. I liked Wilson because of his domestic policies. He was very progressive in so many ways. He worked with labor unions. Other presidents had banned them and tried to suppress them. He supported legislation to limit working hours during the day. He supported women and children in the workplace. Child labor laws were passed. He did so many good things. You have to give him a lot of credit. He did have a dark side. He was a Virginia racist. There's no other way to put it. He was a product of his time. He showed The Birth of a Nation, that racist masterpiece, in the White House, and declared it to be a wonderful movie. He managed to get a lot of black civil servants fired. His predecessor, Teddy Roosevelt, had been very friendly to black people. So he had that thing that I always have to put in an asterisk. He did support women's suffrage. That's an interesting dimension of him. Regarding foreign policy, as you mentioned, he resisted any involvement in the war. Many Americans thought that those Europeans are just killing themselves the way they always do, and we have to stay out of this. People who were Irish, for example, really didn't want to back the British. The only way we were going to enter that war was on the side of the British. And they thought, well, the British are oppressing the Irish, so we certainly don't want that. So there was a strong resistance to any U.S. involvement in that war. Teddy Roosevelt hated him for what he saw as indecisiveness. He said that having Wilson as the World War started would be like having James Buchanan reelected in 1860 instead of Lincoln, and that would have been a disaster since he was a weak person. I think we are particularly interested in his position on Middle East issues. Let's just say that he knew almost nothing about the Middle East except the fact that his father was a Presbyterian minister, a very prominent Presbyterian minister. And there was a constant flow. The Presbyterians had been very active from the middle of the 1800s in promoting education in the Arab world. They created the American University of Beirut, the American University of Cairo, Roberts College in Turkey, and other institutions. And they sent out a lot of missionaries who created local schools. And so those people would come back, and they would always stop by the Wilson household. And so Wilson got a dose as a boy, and then later as an adult. He had very close contact with those missionaries, and for that reason, he was passionately in favor of the Armenian cause. He heard stories firsthand about massacres of Armenians. He was determined to do anything he could to stop it. So in the end, he actually proposed, and when they got around to having a mandate system, he actually proposed a mandate, an American mandate over Armenia. That would have been the Turkish part of Armenia, not the Russian part. And it was vetoed in the Congress, in the Senate, which refused to approve it. I can only think he said, "Does this sound familiar? We can secure that area with a few thousand American soldiers." His opponent said, "No, it's going to take 50,000. It's going to take more soldiers if you're going to hold on to Armenia. You're going to have to fight for it." And so Henry Cabot Lodge and other Republican senators who were described as isolationists, but I think they're probably not. They were the ones who killed that. I just have to think. There's what we call counterfactual history. It's the sort of what if element. What if the Germans had actually invaded Britain in 1940 when the British expected them to? They were just sitting there waiting for the Germans to arrive. And Churchill thought it was basically going to be over. He was going to have to go into exile. What if they had? What would have happened? Well, that's a very interesting question about Armenia. What if the Americans had annexed Armenia? Certainly the Armenians would have become passionately pro-American. We would have been able to mobilize them into large numbers into military security forces, but we would have been right on the border of the Soviet Union. And the whole idea was we're going for a short time. We'll establish this province as an entity, and then we'll pull out. That was the idea. It sounds easy if you say it fast, but once you get in, it's pretty hard to get out. The same thing was true with Syria. There's another thing that's very interesting. When the Europeans got around to dividing up the Arab world, the United States was actually offered Syria as a mandate. And as you mentioned in King Crane, the King Crane Commission, which Wilson sent his two key advisors out there to find out what Arabs thought, which was something that the British and French hadn't bothered to think about very much. What they said was, what we want, our first choice, is to have an Arab kingdom just the way we were promised under an Arab king. That's what we were promised. That's what we want. And they said, well, maybe we're not going to get that because we understand the realities of British and French colonialism. So as a backup, what we do not want is either a British or a French mandate, because we know that once they get their fingers on us, they're never going to let go. So if we have to have a mandate, we want it from the Americans, because they're going to come in. They're not going to want to stay very long, which is interesting. Maybe that was true. They're not going to want to stay very long, and they're going to work with us, and then they're going to leave. So we were actually offered a Syrian mandate. And I keep thinking to myself, again, counterfactual history. What if the United States had accepted a mandate over Syria, which in their thinking, of course, the British and French later broke up Syria, but in their thinking, this was Greater Syria. This included Lebanon. It included Palestine. It included Jordan. What if we had been given that, or maybe even the current country of Syria? You know what we would have done? We would have done what we did when we were given a Boxer settlement from the Chinese uprising. We took all that money and created a scholarship program and brought hundreds of Chinese students to the United States, and they went back and became an extremely pro-American element within the Chinese government. We would have done the same thing, I suspect. We would have brought out hundreds of Syrian students to study in American universities. They would have gone back speaking fluent English and having American friends and American supporters and American allies, and they would have been the rulers of Syria. Isn't that an amazing thought? I think our whole view of subsequent developments, particularly the state of Israel, I think we would have been far more cautious if we had had all of those Syrians. It didn't happen, but that's counterfactual history. What if it had happened?
Just to add to your point,
Yeah.
Professor, according to Professor Ali Allawi from Oxford University, he said that Arab Americans were actually lobbying for an American mandate in Syria rather than a British or a French one.
Isn't that interesting? I didn't know that. And my friend Hani Bawardi has written a wonderful book on early lobbying by Arab Americans. And I'm sure he discusses that, but I didn't remember that. That's very interesting to know. So they probably were reflecting the perspectives of some of their people back in the old country. Thanks on that. What should I say here? Wilson was very opposed to colonies. I mean, that's an American instinct. We, back in the old days, we used to think we were a colony. We didn't like it very much, and we don't think other people would like it very much. So we were opposed to colonies. We were opposed to colonization. We were supportive of the autonomy of independent peoples. And when Wilson got around to writing his 14 points, that famous speech he delivered, he put in there that people should have their own country and their own independence. And I think one thing is important to remember. Everybody listening in on this is probably well aware of the Sykes-Picot Treaty. When during the First World War, the British and the French got together secretly and drew up maps and said, at the end of this war, we're going to divide up Turkey and we're going to divide up the Arab world, and the French are going to get areas basically north of a certain line. That's the current countries of Syria and Lebanon. The British will get what's south of that line. That's the current areas of Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. And the British will get to the east. That's the current country of Iraq. They didn't quite have those names at the time, and the boundaries were a little different, but that's what they agreed to. And that was a secret treaty. No one knew anything about that treaty. And then when the Russian Revolution occurred in November of 1917, the communists, oh, those treacherous people, the communists got into the archives and found those agreements, and they published them. And by the way, the Russians were signatories to that too. They were wanting the Muslim states of the subcontinent, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. They wanted all those regions for themselves. So that was a shock to the world. And when those secret treaties were published, they were the front page story on every single newspaper in the world, except in the United States. The American people were never told about those secret treaties until after the war was over. And when Wilson delivered his speech, which came, let's see now, when was the Russian Revolution? It was beginning of November 1917. And then they call it the October Revolution because it started, and it was our November because they had the 10-month calendar still. But Wilson then was delivering his State of the Union speech in January, and he used that to respond to the Sykes-Picot Treaty, which people didn't know. They read this and they said, open covenants openly agreed to, and they thought, oh, this is a man of very high principles. No, it was damage control. He was trying to reverse what the British and French had secretly agreed to. So I think that's something that often gets overlooked, that these were not just high principles that Wilson came up with. They were actually foreign policy decisions, and they were resistant to British and French foreign policy. What Wilson discovered, because he was not very good in foreign policy, he didn't know foreign policy well. He was not involved in that. Domestic policy was his great strength. When he got to Versailles and started negotiating with the British and French, they just ran circles around him. He said, okay, no more colonies. They said, we completely agree, no more colonies. What we're going to do is have mandates. He says, wait a minute. What's a mandate? By the way, Jan Christian Smuts, the leader of South Africa, had come up with that phrase, mandates. Nobody had heard that term before. He just made it up. He said, well, let's have mandates. What are mandates? Well, whatever they are, they're not colonies. And their efforts really to civilize people. Well, that sounds good, especially if you're a white person around 1919. And so they came up with this whole idea of mandates. And so they created this system of mandates, which I think everybody knows, A, B, and C mandates. A mandates were of those advanced states that were ready for independence with transitional. Let's see, I wrote down the phrase so I wouldn't forget it. Well, anyway, it said they were basically for countries that were provisionally independent. That is, these are advanced countries. These are not backward countries. Syria was not a backward country. The Turks hadn't exactly left those places in poverty and backwardness because they wanted to make money out of them. That was their administrative goal. And so they basically had administrations. They didn't have any political structure because the Turks wouldn't allow that kind of thing. So they needed a temporary advisor. That was the word they used, temporary advice. That meant something within the context of the colonial period. You advised people. That this is the British concept of indirect rule. There was a ruler. He was a local native person. He was in charge, but you advised him, and he did what you told him. So basically, you were overseeing him. That's the idea of a governor general or whatever it might be called. So they wanted to have
just to add, Dr. Stockton, to add to your point of
yes.
President Wilson being inexperienced on foreign policy and having all these games with the British and the French. H.W. Steed was a diplomat at that time who have attended the Versailles Treaty. He said through 30 years, in his book, it's called Through 30 Years, 1892 to 1922. He says President Wilson came out of the meeting that they were discussing the mandate. He says President Wilson came out of the meeting cursing everybody and everything, saying that he had done nothing but talk for 48 hours and was getting disgusted with the whole business.
So Wilson knew immediately he was being had. Yeah. By the way, I just saw the phrase I was looking for a minute ago about the Arab states. Their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized. So those states were recognized
provisionally,
subject to the rendering of administrative advice. So basically, it's interesting. Palestine was recognized as a state with conditional upon advisors who would oversee administration. They weren't supposed to be running the country. They were supposed to be overseeing local people. Now, of course, that ran right head on against the Balfour Declaration and the promise to create a Jewish homeland. But nevertheless, that was there. So there were just to finish up that point I was making. There were the A states; those are the advanced states, basically the Arab states, which are provisionally independent already. They just need to have someone work on their government oversight and things like that. Secondly, there was Africa, which needed a longer period of oversight, but also could become states someday. And then there were the states that were so small or backward that they probably we're just talking the distant future before they could ever govern themselves. And that were the little islands of the Pacific and places like that, including Southwest Africa, which was today in Namibia. But in those days, it just seemed like a totally hopeless a jumble of tribes and desert regions that were not capable of anything. So I said quite a bit. Let me just mention one final thing, just a minute. One is the the King Crane Commission was sent out by Wilson. They interviewed thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people. Directly and indirectly, they received letters, petitions from villages. They had meetings. It was an amazing effort at what we might call public opinion. They wanted to find out, what exactly do the Arabs want? And as I said, what they really wanted was their own state. But they said one thing that really upset people of a certain perspective. The Zionists look forward to a practically complete dispossession of the present non-Jewish inhabitants by some form of buyouts, but they wanted them gone. They wanted a Jewish state. That was their dream. The whole idea that we were going to live in peace with the Arabs, that wasn't seen as credible by the King Crane Commission. And they warned Wilson that if they proposed that there be a Jewish entity within the larger Arab state, which Arabs had supported for a long time. King Abdallah offered that to the Jews in 1947, I think. But the King Crane Commission told Wilson, if you are committed to a larger Jewish state, you must be prepared to send 50,000 American soldiers into Palestine, because that is what it will take to maintain a larger state. It cannot sustain itself without the Americans keeping it afloat with resources and soldiers. So that's the situation where we find ourselves today.
And that's what's happening today, Professor.
Well, it's interesting. We don't have American soldiers there yet, but we did have American
support.
We had American units involved when the Iranians fired towards Israel. And there's a proposal floating around that there be American soldiers sent into Gaza to help manage it. I think that would be a nightmare, because we're not seen as a friendly force coming in to support the Palestinians. And I think the reaction to that would be a catastrophe. But nevertheless, they're still talking about such things.
Yeah. Okay, Professor, I have a question. I believe that President Wilson is a person of controversy. If you look at the 14 points positively, if you look at the King Crane Commission positively, but if you look at the same time at his background, he was one of the earlier pro-Zionists. Woodrow Wilson, he was one of the first to endorse the Balfour Declaration. And he believed that this declaration is a privilege. Exactly, let me tell you exactly what he said. It's a privilege to restore the Holy Land to its rightful owners. Rightful owners. So, I mean, how do you look at this controversy? Positive points, principles from one side, and this endorsement, which almost explodes everything else. How do you look at it?
I'm glad you mentioned this, because it's extremely important. Someone wrote a book called Religious Diplomacy. I can't remember who the author was, but he said that much of our policy in those days was influenced by religious thinking and by religious lobbies. And in the 19th century, I think this is not well known, but 2 decades before the Zionist movement, before Theodor Herzl got his followers together in Basel, Switzerland, and organized the Zionist movement, he had written this book called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. And 2 decades before that, there was an organized movement to return Jews to Palestine. And it was called the Restorationist movement. And they believed that restoring Jews to Palestine was like a Christian obligation. And there's a mistake people make sometimes. They say that this was an effort to bring about the final days and the apocalyptic wars and everything that some people talk about. This is not correct, because there were two ways. Let me just take a divergence here and mention what is called millennialism. There, in Protestantism at that time, there was a belief that there was going to be the return of the Messiah would be accompanied by 1,000 years of justice. Now, the question was, would Christ return at the beginning of that 1,000 years and then bring about the 1,000 years of justice? That was called premillennialism. And then postmillennialism, that after human beings had created 1,000 years of justice, then the Messiah would come and say, okay, you're worthy now, I'm going to come back. These people were premillennialists. They believed there would be a certain time when you would look up in the sky and a band of angels would be there and Jesus would arrive. And as the Bible says, nothing, Jesus says in one of his discourses, that there is nothing anyone can do to speed this up or slow it down. Nothing you can do. You cannot, to use a phrase, a popular phrase today, you cannot force God's hand. Now, in Judaism, there is a belief that you can speed this up. But in Christianity, that was absolutely not the belief. And there are almost no Christians, they're all gone now, who were post-millennialists, who believed that that were premillennial, that believed you could actually do something and then force God to arrive before God was planning to. So so what were those Christians supposed to do? They were supposed to be kind to Jews. They were supposed to support them. And it says, support Israel. Those who are good to the Jews, I will be good to them. And so there are various passages. But Wilson was of that school. Presbyterians in those days were of that school. They're not anymore, but they endorsed that. So he was very definitely what you might call proto-Zionist. And then when someone came up with these resolutions, you're correct. He endorsed them very, very quickly. I think your point is a very valid one, and I'm glad you brought it up.
Okay. Just to add something to this, Professor.
Yes.
I've read a book by Alfred Kollach and David Dallin. It's called The Presidents of the United States and the Jews. It was published in the year 2000. They said exactly that perhaps more than any other president, Woodrow Wilson had the utmost respect and admiration for the Jewish people, and those people consider him a hero and a savior and a man of principle and ethical uprightness. So just to mention this, how much he was close to the Jewish and to the Zionist movement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Professor, it's very interesting, the intricacies of sending the King Crane Commission. In the presence of President Wilson in Paris, there was so much policies put in place to prohibit the Arab delegation led by Faisal, accompanied by Lawrence of Arabia, to speak to President Wilson. Actually, any communication had to go through Colonel West, who is a British military intelligence officer. But Amir Faisal at that time, he was a prince, not a king, but Prince Faisal at that time, he was delighted by the fact that President Wilson was insisting on the commission. And he informed also through Colonel West that the Arabs would rather accept death than a French mandate.
Mm-hmm.
And that the Arabs were willing to entertain an American mandate before entertaining a French mandate.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very delighted. They were very happy. Actually, they have celebrated in Paris. The Arab delegation has celebrated when President Wilson decided to send the commission. And the commission results, which is now published, I mean, any person can purchase the King Crane Commission report that was published a couple of years after it has been written, kind of too late. This is its results put into a map. This is what it has found to be the will of the people there. According to the will of the people, this is the results of the King-Crane Commission. And as you see, the mandate on Syria, the people were more accepting for a US or a UK mandate, but not a French one. And because of some of the minorities in Lebanon, there was some sort of a need for being a self-run area or a semi-autonomous area than the Syrian mandate. The question that I want to come back to you is this we know that President Wilson, and especially from a religious point of view, he was pro-Zionism in its early forms. He was with the declaration, the Balfour Declaration, of creating a national home state for Jews in Palestine, which didn't have really much political interpretation or consequences at that time. But later on, the King-Crane's Commission results, would you think that if President Wilson was still in power and the King-Crane Commission came, the report came to be, what would you think, given what we know, his reaction would be?
Well, that's a good question. I think it would almost be irrelevant, because he had been stifled at Versailles by the British and French, who just ran circles around him. They had been colonizing the world for, a long time, and a couple hundred years, and they weren't going to be slowed down by some American president who had read some books and come up with some dreamy ideas. The second thing was he had been stifled in the United States by the Senate, which was controlled by Republicans and led by Henry Cabot Lodge, who was actually bitterly opposed to, he's almost like a freedom caucus. If Wilson wants it, we're opposed to it. He was a very bitter opponent. So even if Wilson had read this and said, they're 100% right, I'm going to do everything in this report, it wouldn't have had any impact, because he had been stifled overseas and at home. And no president could have gone around those policies, I don't think. I don't think it's surprising at all, by the way, that people were so hostile to the French. They had certainly proven themselves to be not very good at colonizers. And the British had a policy of what was called indirect rule. They said, we will find a local leader and put him in power and let him run every single thing, as long as he lets us oversee the country and its foreign policy and oversee the tax system. And so that some people thought, okay, we can live with that. That's not perfect, but as long as we get to run our own affairs and have our own leaders, that we could live with that. And so I can see why they would much prefer the British over the French, and would much prefer the Americans over the British.
Dr. Ajlani, do you have anything to ask, any remark to make?
I agree with Mr. Dr. Ali Ajami. The personality of Wilson is very contradictory, controversial. He was with Faisal one moment. After he left, he said, I want to respect the integrity of Syria, but he didn't respect it. I want to limit the mandate, limited mandate. It's mean limited mandate. It's mean foreign policy and the army with Faisal, but he didn't respect it. And when Faisal at the last time, he wanted to make sure that Wilson was respected his commitment. He didn't. He feel bad, and he left Faisal alone. Faisal will have a good constitution, a best constitution in the region, in the area. He respected the minorities, constitution with freedom and all things Wilson wanted. But I think Wilson didn't respect his commitment to Faisal in Versailles Conference and in other things. I don't know why. I read it when I was in Canada from American sources. They said that Wilson has not respected his commitment with Faisal.
Can you elaborate, Professor, to this?
Pardon me?
Can you elaborate to this?
Well, I made a couple of points and I'll repeat them. One is that I think Wilson was very naive and inexperienced. The second was that he was driven by certain ways of thinking that were very common in this country at the time. They were very pro Zionist, if you want to use that term. Certainly, they were pro creating a Jewish state. He was influenced by his missionary sources to be very friendly towards the Armenians. He was very hostile to the British and French and their colonial efforts. I think he was buffeted, we might say, from different directions. I'm not surprised. I wasn't aware of the commitments that he made that you just mentioned. I'm glad to hear about those. But I think probably, you know, what they said about Disraeli, that don't count his broken pledges as a crime. He meant them, how he meant them at the time. And I think Wilson was in that category, but he probably everything he said, he meant it. He was not the kind of a person who was a politician who would say one thing and mean something else. The British were very good at that. And so I think if he said something to Wilson, to Faisal, he probably meant it exactly the way he said it. But delivering on those promises, I think, was nearly impossible. So I think we'll have to consider him a failure in that whatever good things he wanted that we today might support, he was unable to produce those outcomes.
Okay. Professor, as Mr. Wissam mentioned earlier, that the King Crane report wasn't published till after President Wilson was out of office. You know, he was in the office from 1913 to 1921, and the report was publicly circulated 1922. And it's well known that the King Crane report at that time made no impact. On the other side, some members of the commission believed that the state. I will repeat that. Some members of the commission believed that the State Department and Zionists were responsible for repressing the report. Now, my question: do you believe, Professor, that if the values of the King Crane Commission were respected and the independence granted to the Arabs who were demanding it, perhaps, don't you think that this perhaps might had put an end to the conflict and will not lead to what we are witnessing now of bloodshed in Gaza and in the region?
I think you're absolutely right. Remember something about the King Crane Commission, that it was originally a multinational commission. The Americans were supposed to be in it with the British and the French, and I think maybe the Italians, and they were all supposed to participate in collecting this data and writing this report. The British and French left because they were pretty sure, they withdrew because they were pretty sure it would produce exactly the results that it produced, and that was not what they wanted. So they had their goals, they were concealed, and they were, as they always are. You know, there's the old saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and someone adds, because you can't trust the English after dark. You know, as soon as the sun goes down, they'll grab your country. And so I think as you look at the King Crane Commission, as you read its recommendations, and particularly its warnings that a Jewish state cannot sustain itself. It will have to be supported by American treasure and by American soldiers. We're already to the treasure part. You can see that the American soldiers are going to be next. When something down the road, which none of us can quite see, happens, we're going to have to support the Israelis, or at least, or not support them. And I think we will support them. So I think the report was absolutely correct. If people had listened to it, it would have produced a very different history. But the reason it was not implemented was because the British and French were far more powerful than the Americans in terms of determining exactly what was going to happen to those Arab territories. And I think by the time the report came out, it was simply a piece of paper. It had no impact whatsoever. I'm sure that President Harding never even had his advisors look at it. It was not something that he wanted to get involved in. Nobody wanted to get involved in it. And the League of Nations was dead from our point of view. We never supported it. So all of those commitments and promises were things of the past.
Okay. Wissam, I have one more question about the 14 points, unless if you have something to say.
Yeah, let me just add something. Some of the other results of the King Crane Commission, Professor, is that this is a part of the summary of the King Crane Commission results. They determined that the form of government in both Iraq and Syria should be a constitutional monarchy with Faisal as king of Syria. So there was the consent of the governed, basically was a consent for King Faisal to rule that area. And also they called for the preservation of the unity of Syria. Of course, Syria includes Palestine, with Lebanon being granted a degree of autonomy within a united Syria. It also rejected the idea of a French mandate, although it has a favored mandate system for both Iraq and Syria, with American mandate, and if not possible, then a British mandate that is temporary. And one of the results says, although the commissioners had started their mission predisposed to the Zionist plans for Palestine, they concluded by recommending that Zionist ambitions be strictly curtailed. They had reached the conclusion that the Zionist project could only be achieved at the expense of the rights of the indigenous Arab population, and then only by force of arms. The King Crane Commission is an American government's official report. Why do we keep producing reports and creating commissions to study things for us, and then we totally ignore it? And can it be resurrected? Can a US president come and say, we're gonna get back to the King's Crane Commission and try to revive it, or revive its recommendations, or create a new a King Crane Commission 2024?
There are so many commissions and reports and studies that simply get ignored. Very often the purpose of having a study is to cause someone to spend 2 years or 3 years spinning their wheels, coming up with pieces of paper, and then you can say, thank you very much, you're dismissed. When the riots, the American riots, occurred in 1965, was it? 60. Anyway, the report, the Commission on Civil Unrest that Lyndon Johnson had commissioned, he never even accepted the report. It's one of the definitive reports on racial issues in this country. And I've used it many times. I've read it. I've used it many times. I've had students read parts of it. Johnson never even met with the commissioners. He just said, oh, thanks a lot, sent them a note. And this is not an unusual thing, that if you get a report that doesn't say what you want it to say, you just ignore it. And so the question is there any politician in America willing to put his political career on the line for some of those positions? I don't think so. It comes down to politics. If someone came out and said, I'm running for president, and the first thing I'm going to do is begin the policies that you, Wissam, just mentioned, that person would not get elected. that the average person the average voter wouldn't even know what he's talking about. And there would be so much opposition and resistance that and distortion and misrepresentation that you would lose. You would spend all your time trying to explain away what it is you're actually talking about and what you're not talking about. So I think that's a thing of the past. I think the principles in it were very good. I think that if it had been implemented at the time, it would have made a difference. But it's gone. That time is gone. We can't go back. By the way, I have to mention one thing about that area involving Lebanon. In 1860, there was a war around Beirut involving the Maronites and I think the Druze, and there was a lot of killing.
Yes.
And the Turks created an autonomous zone there because they said, the Maronite Christians, they're different. They really are different. We can't treat it differently. And the Turks were always able to kind of figure out a way to keep their empire together by accommodating local interests. And so they created a zone there. At the end of the First World War, had they created a zone around Beirut and Mount Lebanon, north of Beirut, which is where the Maronites are concentrated, had they done that, it would have been very logical. It could have been the Lebanese will tell you we were the first self-governing entity in the whole Arab world, and they'll say went back to the time that the Turks created a special zone there for us. And so had they done that, that would have been logical. But you can see what the French did and why people were so afraid of the French. What the French did was take that zone where they had allies, push it north to include Tripoli and some of the areas to the north, then push it to the south to include Sidon and some of the areas in the south, and then push it to the east to go right up to within across the divide there, the mountainous divide, and right up to the edge of what is today Syria. And they created a zone which was not a Christian entity, which would have been logical within a larger federation, but they created a country of Lebanon which was 52% Christian according to the last census that they've done, which was done in the 1930s. And I think part of the problem is that what the Arabs feared was exactly what they got. They got manipulation. They got artificial countries being created that never existed, that had artificial boundaries. The British and the French were very good at manipulating the boundaries. Divide and conquer, the British called it. And I think Wissam, you were probably present when Ilan Pape spoke a month ago in Dearborn, and he said the effort by the British, he blamed the British, but I think the French also get some blame. He said the effort by the British to create states where they never existed, 5 states, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq. The effort to create those states is now coming to an end. Those states are falling apart because they were never real states. And if we look at those states, Iraq is held together with duct tape. It's what is Iraq? I don't know. It's working now as a state, but it's still got a lot of problems. Syria is in the middle of a civil war. You can't tell in Lebanon when you wake up what the situation is because it's always careening on the edge of some kind of catastrophe. And then you've got Israel and Palestine, which have been engaged in what I would call a 100-year-old civil war. And that war is not going to end. If Netanyahu says we're going to completely eliminate Hamas, dream on, Bibi. It's not going to happen. You've got a situation there. You can maybe kill the top leaders, and you can maybe kill a lot of Palestinian soldiers, Hamas soldiers. But the fact is that is an Islamic resistance movement. That's what Hamas means, Islamic resistance. And there is always going to be Islamic resistance. That's not going to go away. So those countries are proving themselves non-viable. Right now, Israel is the strongest state in the region. It has the most powerful economy, most powerful military. It's got a system based on conscious racial consciousness, which keeps them cohesive internally. But that's not going to last very long. Their internal divisions are beginning to show up. So I tell you, this isn't the situation that was created. We're coming to the end of that era. I don't know exactly what's coming next. Elon Papi is a great historian. He can see things that people like me can't see, but he says these states are not viable anymore.
Yeah, and as you can expect, Professor, I was delighted to hear that because I say in the awaited Arab state,
yes,
I say the sentence that it is not the dream to create an Arab state. It is a dream to keep Psychos-Pico statelets alive for more than 100 years. And that's what Elon Papi emphasized, that this region, in the way it is structured right now, it's not viable.
Okay. Professor, I have a last question about the 14 points of Wilson. You know, I have read them in details. There's no mention at all in all the 14 points to the Arab states, to their demands. Only one point number 12, talks about the future of the Ottoman Empire. It mentions exactly the following: the other nationalities which are now under Turkish rule should be assured an undoubted security of life. Undoubted security of life. It could be anywhere. And absolutely unmolested opportunity of autonomous development. Autonomous development. It has nothing to do with independence. It has nothing to do with freedom. It has nothing to do with the demands of the Arab state for creating really Arab states for them. So what are the positiveness of all these points, mainly point number 12?
I think these are what are called creative ambiguity, that when you read it, you can't even tell what it's saying, and different people can interpret it differently. Now, for your listeners who speak Arabic, when the Oslo Accords were released, which talked about peace between Israel and the PLO, one of my friends said, I asked him what he thought, and he said they forgot the dots. Now that's kind of funny, because in Arabic, if you don't have dots, you can't read the thing. You can't tell what it's talking about. I think the 14 points has so many phrases in it that you can't even tell what it means. And when they talk about those countries having their own autonomy, they were talking really about the Balkans, the Kurds, and the Armenians. That's what they were talking about. The Arabs were just sort of left over, and they were being turned over to the British and French. So I don't know what Wilson had in mind, but when you read something like that 12th point, what you have to realize is that it went through days and days of debates and negotiation in what we would today call the National Security Council. Each word was put in or taken out, and that's just the way things go. Some of you will probably remember that there are 4, I think, different maps of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Each time they came up with a map, they argued over it and came up with a different map, and they kept drawing and redrawing it. Well, that's the way those a presidential speech is written. It's written after much debate and deliberation, and they take out specific words and put in ambiguous words so nobody can tell what the heck they're talking about, and everybody thinks they were taken care of, which they were probably not.
Okay. Dr. Ajlan, do you have any other question, any other thing to say? Oh, no, unmute, Doctor. Yes. Again.
Okay. Okay, it's okay.
It's okay.
I read from few days a book about Christian Zionist Jean-Pierre Feliu, who is a French journalist, he said that the idea of a Zionist was born in America. And the father of it was George Bush, not George Bush, the father of American president, but its uncle of George Bush. He said that Jewish must return back to Palestine and establish a state. And but because in this state, Jesus Christ will come back after it will be a big state. It's my question is Wilson is from this church, Protestant church, who proclaim Zionist states. It was born before Herzl and the Zionist Jewish. It was a Christian Zionist. It's Wilson has a rapport or relation with this idea. I don't know. Wilson.
I think this is true, and that's what I mentioned, that in the around 1880 or so, there were across the Midwest what they called restorationist conferences, and these were Protestants, and would have sermons over and over, sermons about why restoring the Jews to Israel, to Jerusalem, was actually God's intention, and this was not post-millennialist as I defined it. They were not trying to change God's decision about when Christ should return, but they were premillennialists, thinking that God will return when Christ will return when that is decided by not humans. So I think that person that you read is absolutely correct, that this period started at least 20 years before Herzl. This was very active in the American Midwest well before Herzl. And let me just tell you one little phrase that might surprise you. There's a phrase that Herzl used, about that the Zionists used, a land without a people for people without a land. That was actually an American land, a slogan by American land developers who would get I know because my wife's grandfather got some land under that program. That there was a piece of land in Mobile, Alabama, where people could acquire 5 acres of land. And so a young guy who had no land and no family background or anything could go down there and acquire 5 acres of land. And now he would be a landowner, and he could grow fruits and vegetables and make a living. So that whole idea, a land without people for people without land, that's for Americans. The Zionists just adopted it. So they didn't think it up. The Americans had thought it up.
Okay. Professor, I want to thank you for all this great, beautiful presence among us. Thanks you for joining us again. And next week, we'll be together again just to review your trip to Palestine. And I will leave it to Wissam to end the session.
Thank you very much, Professor, and welcome back from your very rich visit to Palestine, and we hope to see you next week, same time, to discuss your trip and your impressions from your visit to Palestine that took place recently. Thank you, everyone, for your participation, and we'll see you in the upcoming episodes of the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Thank you.
Thank you.